One of our viewers asked, well, here's what the viewer says. I've heard people on YouTube call gouache a watercolor, but I can't find out what is the difference between gouache and watercolor. If gouache is a watercolor, why not just call it watercolor? Please explain. Well, there's probably more difference than you realize. Well, let's go through the differences and compare them as we go. One of the major differences between gouache and watercolor is that watercolor, by the way, I have on my palette here, this is watercolor, this is gouache. Now, watercolor can be kept on the palette all the time, and it can be re-wet and reworked. Gouache, if left on the palette, is going to crack. And if left on the palette, it dries so quickly that if left on the palette, it will dry into a real hard ball, and it will re-wet, but it's hard to get it back to the kinds of consistency that we need to let it do its thing. So that's one of the major differences between the two. Another major difference between the two is the kind of brush that will work with them. Now, here I want to show you two kinds of brushes that we have. We have all kinds of brushes available to us with both gouache and watercolor, and all the mediums, in fact. But the synthetic brush like this is a little bit stiffer in generally the way the synthetic brushes are made. They're a little bit stiffer than the softer hair brushes or the natural hair brushes made for watercolor or water media. So you can see this is, I don't know, I can feel it, you can't feel it. But this is a little bit gentler, a little softer to work with. So you have a little bit more control. This one you have almost too much control. Now here's the deal: you can use the softer brushes with gouache when it's very wet, but you have more control if you use the synthetic brushes. So the kind of brushes you use for each does differ, especially for the flat brushes. The flatter or the stiffer the flat brush is, the more control we can have with it in gouache. And with watercolor, generally we don't want those flat brushes to be too stiff. We want them to have enough flexibility or spring to them so that we can control what happens with them. So there's another difference. Now another difference is in the way the color works. So I'm going to show you that here. Show you a little bit about that here. For watercolor to work, it's got to be activated with water. Now, if you put watercolor straight out of the tube on the paper or on whatever surface you're working on, it will not thoroughly dry. It will remain sticky. But gouache dries thoroughly. So you can put gouache on straight out of the tube. You can use gouache straight out of the tube to paint with, but not watercolor. Watercolor has to be activated. So I can show you that little demonstration here. That well, what I can't show you is that when they dry, what happens as a result. If the watercolor is not activated, it's going to be sticky. It will not dry thoroughly. Now, the difference in the way the two paints are formulated, yes, they're both water media, and they both work very much the same way in some methods of painting, but they're different in these distinct ways, and this is what the viewer asked. So with watercolor, we reactivate. Now we can use it straight out of the tube, and this is pretty much straight out of the tube, but we reactivate it by adding water to it like this, and that gives it a transparency. So if I stroke this on the paper, wet on dry, when it dries, it dries with a luminous quality. It keeps that luminous quality of the paint. If I do the same thing with gouache, where I thin it, I can do that. I can use gouache that way. But if I do the same thing with gouache, two things will happen. It will, you see, you can activate it, and you can use it very much the same as watercolor, like that. But when it dries, it's going to dry a little darker. And when it dries, if it's too activated, it's not going to have the brilliance. You're going to be able to see the particles of paint. As this dries, watercolor tends to get a little bit lighter as it dries. Gouache tends to go a little darker as it dries. So there's another difference. And the way we use them in painting, to get our lights in painting, to get our lights with watercolor, we simply add more water. Water is the white. Really, the paper is the white in watercolor. So you see, if I use a very light wash with watercolor, then I can get a very pale color, a very light value of this color. But if I can do that with gouache, but when it dries, it's going to dry a little darker. Also, when it dries, it's going to not have the brilliance that the watercolor has when it dries. So with gouache, we can mix white. Now, some people will mix white with watercolor. It changes the character of the color. White always changes the character of the color. But some people will use white when they're mixing watercolor. But it doesn't have it changes the color and changes the character. And it doesn't you don't see that brilliance of the paper coming through. So let me get now the one of the gouache brushes and show you without it being wet. This you can do with gouache that you cannot do with watercolor, and this makes gouache very much like a painting with gouache, very much like painting with oil or acrylic. You can do the same techniques with gouache that you can do with oils and acrylic, and you cannot do with watercolor. So there's another difference. So I'll get the major part of the water out of the brush. All right, so here we go. There it is, straight out of the tube. And with gouache, we can do that. With gouache, we can paint straight out of the tube. And to make it lighter, then, we just add white. And then we can do this, and we can blend it just like we do with oil. We can blend it, we can gradate it. Now the thing is with gouache, though, just like acrylic, you have to work very fast, because if you work too slow, it's going to dry. And when it dries, I'll show you what you can do, because this will dry while I'm working. But when it dries, you have to then dampen it or kind of activate it just a little bit if you want to blend further, such as colors like this. Now that is drying. Notice something else. With gouache, you can get this kind of effect that you cannot get with watercolor. You can get the textures of the brush stroke. So let's just pull that in like this. You see, we've got textures of the brush stroke. And I mean, that will not happen with watercolor, because if you try to do that same kind of thing with watercolor, you have it too thick, it's not going to dry. It's going to be sticky when it dries. So as that's beginning to kind of dry a little bit, I don't know if you can tell that it's getting darker as it dries, but that's one of the things that's a little bit tricky about working with gouache. You have to compensate as you're working. You compensate for what you know is going to happen when it dries. It's going to be a little bit darker. So I think maybe this might be, let's see if it is. So you can use dry enough for us to show you something else you can do here that it's a little tricky when you do with watercolor. Now this is a fine mister, and I can just give a slight hit, just like that. If I do too much, it'll be too runny. It'll grow out of control. And then I can take the brush and begin to work back into it. You see there? And now I can get a smoother gradation just by slightly dampening the surface. But you notice that you have to hit it with a really light stroke, or it will dig into the paint, just like with oil. And so the brush techniques, working with gouache are really no different from working with oil. Now, if I do that with watercolor, I can lift out. Show you what I mean by that. I'm going to use one of the stiffer brushes for lifting out. So, oh, by the way, you can use the stiffer brushes with watercolor. They work to do special effects with watercolor. So the brushes are interchangeable in some techniques, and the stiffer brushes work better with gouache, and the more flexible brushes work better with watercolor and other techniques. Now you see already what happens here. That color runs down, and then I can move back into watercolor, and I can lift out. And so now I can do that in gouache too, but I have to be careful because if I do too much of that with gouache, then it starts getting muddy. So those are the major differences between gouache and watercolor. Let me say something else about gouache, and that is, if you're an oil painter or an acrylic painter, gouache is a wonderful technique, a wonderful material for taking with you out to do field studies. That's how I use gouache. I love doing that, where I can do quick field studies, small little studies. I can do quick field studies and study the color and study how the light's changing. So many things I can study in my sketchbook without having to condition the paper, because the sketchbook paper will take the gouache without it getting all crinkly and out of control like it will if you try to work watercolor on sketchbook. So there's one recommendation if you're really interested in how gouache works. Go to James Gurney's YouTube channel. It's spelled G-U-R-N-E-Y, James Gurney, because he uses gouache a lot when he's out painting in plein air. He does these small little paintings in his sketchbook, but he uses gouache a lot, so he can show you the different techniques and how gouache works now that you know the difference between gouache and watercolor. Be sure to view all of our quick tips, and while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to dyingminds.com, where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.